Namaste. Welcome to Sipping on Stories podcast. I'm your host Irene, and this is where we welcome women healers and spiritual leaders from all around the world to come and share their journeys and their experiences with us. And of course, we do them over warm cups and deep thoughts. For those who have been enjoying our podcast episodes so far, thank you so much for showing your love. And for those who are new to this channel, welcome. Please like and subscribe so we can continue sharing this love. Thank you. Namaste, Debbie. Welcome to Sipping on Stories podcast. I am very happy to have you today. And please tell us where you're joining us from today.
Yeah, thanks, Saren. Lovely to be here too. Joining you from Melbourne today.
Awesome. I'm based in Melbourne too, so we both can agree the weather sucks today. It's gloomy out there.
We absolutely can. I don't have a cup to cheers you, but yes, we absolutely can
That's
agree
fine.
the weather sucks.
A bottle of water will just do fine. Great. All right, Debbie, I think today we're here to kind of talk about what your journey has been like and how you help people deepen their relationship with oneself. So I think it's very important. The first and foremost relationship you have with yourself is very important. And I cannot agree more that you have to do everything you can to work with that or relationship with yourself, because it helps you see, look at the world from a different lens, from a different perspective. And a lot of the things that you feel is difficult or you're struggling with suddenly becomes easy. So I know that you are an expert in here. So why don't you tell us, give a little bit of introduction about yourself, is what you do, and then tell us what got you here, what was your personal journey like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Saren. Yeah, so I guess kind of from in terms of what I do now, I have trained in quite a number of modalities. I work as a somatic therapist and a holistic coach. I'm also a provisional counsellor at the end of my master's, and I also teach mindfulness practices and Qigong, which for those who haven't heard of Qigong is a little bit like Tai Chi.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, really work with women in particular around kind of building relationship with self. And that can have many, many different components to it that are unique to each individual woman that I work with. And my journey and why this is kind of an area that I'm really passionate about, I have kind of experienced firsthand. We often have this kind of cliche about, in order to have sort of the kinds of relationships you want in life, you really need to learn to love yourself first. And that we could argue a little bit with that statement, because sometimes it's actually receiving that love from others that helps us to learn how to love ourselves first. So it can be a little bit of a chicken and egg kind of thing.
Right.
But I guess for myself in my own journey, I've really experienced firsthand kind of the challenges that can be involved
Yeah.
when you're somebody who doesn't have a good relationship with self. So I used to be very much low self-esteem, lacking confidence, quite shy. I was definitely a people pleaser. I found it really hard to say no. I didn't have very healthy boundaries. And as a result of that, I found myself in kind of toxic relationships that left me feeling not only quite depleted, but actually struggling with trauma, struggling with chronic illness. And it's been through that whole journey that I've gone through, healing my own trauma, getting to the point where I'm having healthier relationships and going through pretty significant chronic illness for 15 years, that I've learned the hard way how critically important having a healthy relationship with self is, and how much that has a knock-on effect to absolutely everything in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting. And I can tell that sometimes, you're talking about it so passionately. So you have firsthand experienced what it is like, and also to truly care for yourself, right? So you said that now you help women in particular, helping them deepen their relationship with self. So in your perspective, what does self-care look like?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I think, there was no subject in school that taught
Mm,
us what we actually mean by self-care. And it's become a bit of a kind of buzzword or catchphrase, right, that gets thrown around a bit.
mm,
We sort of, it conjures up images of like glossy photos of women in bubble baths or meditating in idyllic places, that kind of thing. And while those things can be self-care,
mm,
it's not necessarily what we're talking about when we talk about true self-care.
mm,
So when we're kind of looking at true self-care, there's kind of four sort of components that I would suggest that we're looking at when we're looking at true self-care. And the first one is that it's a bit of a balance between discipline and enjoyment.
mhm,
So some of those things that we see talked about with self-care, the bubble baths and the massages, that's great. That falls very much, I would imagine, for most people on that enjoyment side of the spectrum. Um, but true self-care also includes things that maybe aren't so fun to do, that require levels of discipline. And
mhm,
it's finding that balance. If it's all enjoyment, then we're perhaps not actually being disciplined in
mhm,
true self-care. And if it's all discipline and responsibility, then we can start to feel kind of weighted
mm,
down and not
mm.
have that lightness and that pleasure in
Yeah,
our lives.
I agree. And I think this is a great segue, because I thought, as we're talking about self-care and what self-care looks like, because when you think of self-care, everyone, including myself, would have thought about a bubble bath.
Yeah.
Would have thought about getting a massage, go get my nails done. But whilst that is important, in indulging in being, the woman you are, indulging in, taking care of yourself, but there's more to it, as I understand. So I
There
thought we'll
is.
play a little game. I call this
Yeah.
game Myth or Not. So I'll ask you five
Great.
questions, or five myths. I'll state them, and you will
Yep.
tell me if it's a myth or it's a fact.
Great.
Okay. All right. So first one here I have is self-care is a selfish indulgence.
Definitely a myth. Yeah. When we're looking at self-care, as we've just talked about, it can include that discipline, and it
Mm,
can include things like paying our bills and doing exercise, kind of honoring our own boundaries. All of those are ways that we do
mm.
self-care. So it's definitely not self-indulgent.
Yeah. And I think from my perspective too, is that when you can't give, when you have an empty cup yourself, you need that time to re-energize and fill your own cup before you go ahead and give. So
100%.
awesome. All
100%.
right. So second myth that I have here is self-care is exclusively for women.
Also a myth. We're all human. We all need self-care. It's, as you say, it's a critical importance that has knock-on effects to the kind of way that we show up in our relationships, our work, whether we feel fulfilled or not in our
Mm,
lives, whether we're able to be self-expressed.
yeah.
And all of those things are definitely not just for women.
Mm,
Uh, we do find that in some ways, perhaps there has been um, kind of more, and this is a gross generalization, so not saying that this is
yeah.
true in all instances. Women have often been socialized to very much put their needs second to other people. And so while self-care is not only for women,
Mm,
um, there can be a tendency more for women to neglect their self-care and need a little bit more sort of focus and development
Mm,
of these kind of self-care practices, and
mm,
have that be validated
mm,
that it's okay for them to do self-care.
right. Okay. Interesting. The third myth that I've got here is self-care doesn't have any benefits. It is an excuse to pamper oneself.
Yes, once again, definitely a myth. Self-care, and we can talk about this in a little bit. I've got a bit of an outline that I can give you that really gives you a demonstration that we're talking about a lot more than just kind of pampering.
Mm,
And the knock-on effects, as we've said, to the kinds of the quality of your relationships, the intimacy that you can create, your health and well-being,
mhm,
how you can show up in your life. All of those things are very real knock-on effects of our
mm.
self-care practices.
All right. Good to know. The fourth myth that I have here is self-care is expensive.
Yeah, once again, definitely a myth. I mean, it can be. There can be elements of self-care. You know, if we're getting massages every week, that can be expensive. But once again, you know, self-care, we can be looking at small things. It's the same. There's another myth around self-care, like I don't have time for
Mm,
self-care. If I particularly encounter that a lot, you know, with mothers with young children. You know, how do I do self-care when I'm
mm,
so kind of, I've got so many demands on me? Self-care can be as simple as taking a pause and a conscious breath a few times throughout your day, which
mm,
doesn't cost anything and doesn't take up much time at all.
mm. And what are other kind of self-care practices would you list down, Debbie, that are maybe that women can follow? They just do at home. They don't have to pay any money for doing it, but something that we all can follow.
Yeah, so we can kind of look, if we come back to kind of the four principles. So the first one we chatted about being that balance between discipline
Mhm.
and enjoyment.
Yeah.
We then also look at whether it's what we call kind of true self-care or false self-care.
Hmm.
So false self-care, we're talking very much about, and this is not in any way shaming anyone for this, because we all have our moments where we need this, but um, false self-care we can kind of think is like short-term gain, but might have long-term pain. So it's like indulging in eating a whole block of chocolate might give you comfort in the short term,
Mm,
but maybe has longer term health impacts that aren't actually aligned with your self-care.
mm,
Whereas true self-care is more things that are in service of kind of your highest self, or your kind of greatest,
mm.
best version of yourself.
Right.
And they're often, not always, but often can actually involve a little bit of short-term discomfort in
Mm,
order to get the long-term gain. So we can see this, for example, with things like exercise. You know, if you're somebody that doesn't love, I mean, some people absolutely love exercise, but some people don't.
mm,
So it might be a little uncomfortable to be doing the exercise in the short term. You've got to forego watching that episode on Netflix to go out in the cold and go for a walk,
mm,
particularly if you're living in Melbourne at the moment. Um, but long term, that's serving your self-care. So that's kind of the second component. And then the third component, we can think of self-care occurring in all of the different domains that are kind of part of our lives. So
yeah.
our sort of mental or intellectual domain, our more emotional domain, our physical domain, and then also our spiritual domain. So
Mm,
self-care can occur in all of those.
mm,
And then the fourth component is it's absolutely unique to each individual. So it can't be dictated externally. We've got to have the support to find internally what
Mm,
self-care looks like for
right.
us.
Mm. And I would imagine that when you do work with women closely, you go through step through these four components and help them recognize each of them. And with that actually brings me to my fifth myth that I have is self-care practices are the same for everyone.
Yeah, so as we've mentioned, no, they're definitely unique.
Mm,
So what I would generally do, I kind of, there's a few different models that I help women with around kind of self-care practices. And I would generally take, it's actually a model by one of my mentors, Remy Pearson, who's quite a well-known coach,
mhm,
called the self-esteem triad, which looks at emotions, boundaries, and needs.
mhm.
And then I would also add into that kind of our values
Yeah.
and self-compassion. So we generally look at those 5 components.
Mhm.
And to give you an example, like within needs, for example, we can draw on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which looks at, for example, physiological needs. So
Yeah.
we can be looking at self-care practices for diet, for exercise, for stress relief.
Mm,
Um, then we also have one of Maslow's other needs is around safety. So we
mm,
can look at kind of what people do we have in our lives that give us a sense of support, of safety, and how do we go at regulating our own nervous system out of fight and flight and freeze?
yeah.
Can we actually find safety within our own bodies?
Mm,
So there's a number of other needs.
mm,
And so, for example, then um, we can start getting into self-care looking like things like aligning with our values. If I
mm,
have a value of playfulness, for example, how do I integrate playfulness into my day? That can
yeah.
be one of our self-care practices.
Mm,
Equally, we've talked a bit about physiological needs. That's quite a common one to look at for
mm,
self-care. But
right.
then things like safety, for example, might include self-care practices like making sure we have car insurance or
Mm,
that we've paid our telephone bill this
huh?
week. They can actually be self-care practices.
Oh, that's interesting. I would have never thought that you can actually link self-care practices to the values. It's quite an interesting way to approach self-care. Um, and um, and again, I think what would you recommend for some other kind of values people have and how you kind of connect self-care to? Because I want to make sure that the listeners we have today might, have some more examples so they'll be able to connect and use these in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I actually thought that I'd be happy to offer to your listeners is if anybody, if you wanted to send me through email addresses of anybody that's interested, I actually have a workbook that steps people through some of the core questions in each of the realms of
Yeah.
self-care that
Mm,
might give them a little bit of a start in how to kind of break this down a bit for themselves.
right.
So I'm more than happy to kind of share that with anybody that's interested.
Yeah.
When we're talking about values, so that's kind of one particular area of self-care, and everybody has very unique values. So
Mm,
it can be hard to sort of give concrete examples without knowing what somebody's values are.
right.
But what I do is I work with people. I've got a couple of sessions called values elicitations.
Mm,
And I actually work with people to determine kind of what are their core values.
mm,
And then from that, we can actually,
yeah.
it sort of kind of then has a knock-on effect. So the values lead to kind of what are our self-care practices. And
Mhm.
then part of that can also be, what boundaries do we
Yeah.
need to set up in our life in order to honor those?
Right. Okay. And now, if you could maybe, let's say, for example, I'll take my example.
Yep.
I do not like exercising. Exercising is like, oh my God, it's like another thing to do in my list. And
Yep.
so when you do have people like that come to you and where it cannot, exercise cannot be one of their kind of self-care tools, right?
Mhm.
What have you like recommended, or if you can maybe shed some light on that space?
Yeah, so once again, it can kind of be looking at um, that aspect of kind of discipline over enjoyment. We can also look at it as what we term like a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset.
Mhm.
So a fixed mindset is more likely to go, I don't like exercise, so I don't want to do it. So what's my other option?
Yeah.
As a growth mindset is more likely to go, okay, so I don't love exercise, but I know that I do value health and well-being, and I do
Mm,
value perhaps being able to show up for my kids or for my partner. And I know that one of the things that's going to help me to do that is, in the short term, having the
mm,
discomfort of the exercise that I don't like, in order to be aligned with my higher value of my
mm.
well-being.
Right.
So that's one of the ways that we can do. Another
Mhm.
thing that we can look at is actually explore what is somebody's beliefs. So we all have limiting beliefs. And so I might have developed some really limiting beliefs
Mm,
about exercise.
mhm.
So it can be useful to identify what those limiting beliefs are, and
Mm,
then work on what would be a more kind of resourceful, more empowering belief that you might choose to hold around exercise.
okay.
And then another way that we can look at it is also considering, how might we bring pleasure into exercise? So
Mm,
we call this pleasure pairing. So maybe you don't like doing exercise, but you love listening to audiobooks, for
mm.
example. Then you can pair the exercise with that pleasurable activity to help make that more palatable.
Yeah, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Like, for example, you can just go on a little walk while you're listening to your audiobook. Or
Exactly.
I think for me, I do not like exercise, but if it's paired with something fun, like maybe dancing, I would enjoy it. So,
Exactly.
okay, all right,
Exactly.
interesting.
So then we can find those unique ways that work for
Hmm.
each individual person to kind of support them with that more growth mindset way of looking at it.
Oh, it's really interesting. Who would have thought? Okay. All right. I think Debbie, from here, if you could share why someone should consider getting help in developing a healthy relationship with self,
Mhm.
and when should one start, and who is it for?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, really, when we're in terms of kind of the why,
Mm,
Um, if we've sort of touched on that a little bit already, that we can kind of see when we don't have a healthy relationship with self, we tend to then be, kind of aspects that you might notice in yourself if you don't have a healthy relationship with self can be things like not having good boundaries,
mm,
feeling like you always have to say yes,
yeah.
feeling overwhelmed, feeling exhausted, feeling anxious, feeling
Mm,
stressed, feeling like your relationships maybe are a little more one-sided, um,
mm,
feeling like perhaps you don't have value other than for what you do for others. So you're kind of disconnected from your own sort of innate inherent value.
mhm,
You might also feel like you have difficulty taking risks in your life. You remain kind of in your comfort zone because being out of control, you kind of don't trust your own resilience or your own capability to handle uncertainty. So some of these are kind of ways in which we might be experiencing kind of what it looks like to not have such a good relationship with self.
Right.
Equally, we can feel a bit incongruent, like we struggle to express ourselves authentically, or we don't feel that we are aligned with our values. So our life maybe feels a bit flat or a bit empty or lacking a level of fulfillment. All of these can be ways in which we're experiencing a kind of a lack of a healthy relationship with self.
Right.
And getting help with developing a healthy relationship with self can be really important, because we can imagine if you are in a place where you don't have such a healthy relationship with self, it's going to be a little tricky for you to access your own wisdom and trust that if if you're not very in touch with it.
Yeah.
So getting some help from the outside can be really useful to gradually build that connection with your own wisdom and that trust in yourself
Yeah.
to kind of navigate your life from that wisdom.
Yes. Right. And what I'm understanding is that the first step that you take towards your self-care is, or true self-care in this kind of setting, is recognizing that you haven't been, going in deeper within to understand yourself or to take care of yourself in a true sense. I guess recognizing that is the first step. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. It's almost like we're kind of turning the spotlight inward a little bit. So oftentimes we might have had that spotlight on the external world. How do I look after the needs of my loved ones? How do I show up for other people? And it's recognizing that when we're shining that spotlight solely externally, we're kind of neglecting to shine any light on the inner experience and what our inner needs and passions are.
Yeah.
So it's kind of recognizing that it's great to have that spotlight pointing outwards, and we also need to bring some of that light internally to our inner landscape.
Yep. Oh, beautiful. And this not only helps us kind of navigate through life, but you're juggling as a woman, you're juggling with so many things. Like you've got family, you've got, of course, your partner, and you've got your kids, you've got work. So it really allows you to ease into this and to have a balance and really get through without any struggles and breakdowns. So I think that's great. And would you have any kind of your client stories maybe you can share today with us and our listeners?
Yeah. Yeah, let me think of what I could share in
I've
that
put you in the
space.
spot. The spotlight's on Debbie.
Yeah. Just trying to think what I can share in that space. Being conscious too of kind of client confidentiality. So I'll keep
Right.
it keep it more broad, because
Yeah.
I do really it's important, very important to kind of honor that confidentiality space with clients. But I do have a couple of clients who have given me permission to share some of their stories. So it's things like, for example, I've had a client recently who we worked a bit on using a particular model called Be, Do, Have, Give. And I won't go into all of that, but working with her, there was somebody close to her that was passing away. And working with her around what she truly wanted for their relationship in those kind of final weeks. and who she wanted to be in that relationship, how she wanted to show up in that relationship. And we worked a little bit on that, which helped her to get much clearer about herself and that relationship with herself, who she wanted to be. And then it also had remarkable results in the external that then, through getting really clear on how she wanted to show up and what felt authentic and true for her, that then ended up manifesting into a greatly increased intimacy and a really rich relationship with this person towards their end of their life, which has then left her feeling so much more complete around that relationship. So that's one example. I have another client who has gone through challenges with, kind of dysfunctional relationships that weren't very healthy for her, and very much being somebody that was putting others' needs first, very much focusing on what others wanted and kind of falling into alignment with what her partners wanted, not being very connected to what her needs were and what her desires were. And through the course of our work together, she just created miraculous changes in her life. She became much more embodied, so she was much more connected to the sensations in her body, to her emotions, felt much more capable of being with her emotions, so not kind of scared to be overwhelmed by her emotions, but we built up her tools to be able to be with those emotions. She started setting really kind of powerful, clean and clear boundaries in her life, and established some of these self-care practices that were very aligned and very unique to her, which has then opened her up to these great kind of explorations of her creativity, which had been something that had been a bit stifled, and has given these kind of new areas of passion and enjoyment, and led to relationships where she's feeling much more met as to who she truly is, because she's now in touch with that herself.
That's so beautiful. Who would have thought what true self-care actually looks like? So this is what true self-care actually looks like. So, oh, great. Thank you so much, Debbie, for sharing this with us today. It has truly been quite empowering, I would say, an empowering episode. But sadly, we have to wrap it up as we have come to an end of the episode. But just before we wrap it up and say goodbye, but if you have any final words for our listeners today, or even a quote that you absolutely love and you would like to share, go for it.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Saren. Yeah, I do have a quote which is by anonymous. I don't actually know who the author is. But it's that the greatest journey that we can ever take is the journey to find ourselves. And I think that that's very, very true.
Love it. Yes, it is. And I cannot agree more after this episode. You have indeed, opened my eyes to a new perspective of what self-care looks like. And I'm pretty sure we have done that to our listeners today as well. So thank you so much, Debbie, for coming on Sipping on Stories podcast, and sharing your journey and sharing the lovely work you do with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here and lovely to chat to all of your listeners. And all the best with your self-care for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.